Welcome. My name is Nick Simi. I'm a physical therapist and athletic trainer here in Northeast Ohio with Akron Children's Hospital and the University of Akron, working with high school athletes and college athletes. Fortunate enough to be joined by Daniel Yu and Dr. Jordan Troester here. So Daniel and I had created the CPSS study group, overwhelmed with the amount of support in this group. And our goal is to get you guys certified for this NSCA and this new exam and certification. And with that, we're going through 2 chapters a week to cover the textbook. We had covered KPIs at one point earlier on in the book, and it was something that I definitely feel like could be touched on a little bit more. And to have Jordan's oversight and insight into this topic is awesome. So I'm really excited for tonight. So Daniel, if you want to introduce yourself real quick, and then get started here.
Yeah, hey everyone, my name is Daniel. I'm currently the sports scientist for the Orlando Magic. Just heading up the CPSS group with Nick as well. Really overwhelmed with everyone's support. We hit 1,000 members last night. Thank you to Jordan for being here for this talk. And yeah, just really excited to learn.
So without further ado here, so Jordan is the current director of performance and sports science at the University of Oregon. And like I mentioned in my LinkedIn post, his prior experiences in professional rugby, the NHL, and again, he has his PhD in sports science from the University of Technology, Sydney. So again, without further ado, welcome, Jordan. Thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Nick. I'm excited to have a chance just to share a little bit of my perspective with you all and hopefully learn from you as well, understand your perspective. And I think one of the things we'll touch on a little bit in this conversation about performance profiling KPIs is the importance of perspective. So let me go ahead and share my screen here, and we're going to jump right into it. My goal today is to not talk at you too much, although I have a tendency to do that just a little bit. But I want to make this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to try to stop and ask for questions or comments or discussions throughout. There's a few breaks that will be good opportunities, and please feel free, maybe Nick, if you'll keep an eye on the chat and so that we can be strategic about addressing those in real time. It's always hard when you get to the end and yeah, don't have enough time for questions. And I want this to be a discussion as much as anything. This is actually a variation of a presentation I gave to the Northern California NSCA Regional Clinic about a year ago, and a topic that's pretty close to me. I think for me, performance profiling is one of the keys or foundational skills within sports science as a whole. And so I think it's a great place to start, but it can be a little bit daunting as you get going. So today we want to talk about performance profiling, and depending on your background, it's a lot more than just profiling strength and conditioning, right? There's a lot more to it, and all those pieces need to be understood together. So a little bit about my journey of performance profiling. I call this 5 blind hockey scouts and an elephant, right? You may have heard the tale of the 5 blind men and an elephant, right? They wander around and they're like each feeling a different part of the elephant. To some, it's like, oh, it's a garden hose, and others say like, no, it's a tent, and others say, no, it's a tree trunk. Depending on which part of the elephant like they're intimately experiencing, their perception of it as a whole is going to be very, very different. For me, several years ago, I'm sitting in a room with a handful of hockey scouts. Now, these are guys who travel the world in cold hockey rinks, drinking bad coffee, watching kids like skate around, and they're taking notes and trying to evaluate a player's like speed, his shooting ability, his puck handling, all these different qualities. And we're sitting in a room and we're debating back and forth about like, oh no, this kid is one of the fastest skaters I've seen. And another person says, well, I think his foot speed isn't very good. And it became very apparent in a short amount of time that there was not a shared understanding and definition of speed when it came to evaluating hockey talent. There wasn't a shared understanding of any of these qualities. As a matter of fact, each scout relied on their experience and their own definition of what they were looking for when it came to some of these physical or technical, these sport related qualities. And So for me, that was, hey, the first thing that we need to do is actually define what we're looking for, define what good looks like and what bad looks like, so that we're all on the same page when we're evaluating these kids. It doesn't have to be an exact science, but let's at least all get on the same page. So perspective matters, and performance profiling at its core is nothing more than a tremendous opportunity to collaborate with the people in that environment, including the athlete themselves a lot of times, and create clarity around what our goals actually are, and define a path to achieving those goals. So in today's chat, I want to touch a little bit on the origins of performance profiling. It might actually surprise you a little bit. I'll take you through some profiling methods, and then I want to touch on the practical applications. Once we've profiled, what do we do then? What do we actually take action on? So we're going to jump right into it here. Performance profiling actually predates sports technology, right? A lot of times we think about what we can measure, speed, strength, there AI, like movement analysis. There's a new company that, sends me an email just about every week. It's growing at an exponential rate, but way back in the 1980s, Butler and Hardy, a couple sports psychologists from the UK, were working with Great Britain Boxing, and they published some really unique research on this concept of performance profiling. And they talked about a few of the real benefits of that. One of them being talent identification, but the other being athlete development. And they kind of built this model, or I would say we often think of it as talent identification and athlete development alone. Like we stop there when we think about why performance profiling, but they went deeper and touched on the concepts of self-awareness, motivation, and confidence. When you bring the athlete into the process and involve them in the performance profile rather than like sitting from a distance and profiling someone else, right? Nobody likes to be profiled, but they actually generates a lot of buy-in when you include them in that process. And so ultimately, they identified a lot of different benefits of this approach to performance profiling. And we're going to go through that a little bit today. There's a couple steps in this Butler and Hardy model. The first step is introducing the concept of performance and profiling, explaining the purpose and benefits to all the stakeholders involved, coaches, support staff, and the athletes themselves, and providing some examples of how that's done well. Now, the method that they proposed was very subjective in nature, actually. Let's all get everybody in a room. Let's maybe break up into position groups. So I use our women's lacrosse team as an example occasionally. Let's break up into midfielders, the defenders, attackers, and let's actually brainstorm the qualities that underpin performance. And the question that they recommend is, what, in your opinion, are the qualities or characteristics of an elite athlete in your sport and position? Pretty basic, but start brainstorming and creating a culture where brainstorming is valued rather than like criticism and judgment is valued is actually a brilliant step to start with, right? If you can create a team and an organization with that mindset, you're already miles ahead of a lot of other people. But let's brainstorm the qualities that are important. So each group, attackers, middies, defenders, maybe they think, all right, like speed is really important for us as middies, like our conditioning, we got to work up and down the field a lot. So that's really important. Actually, like my ability to like protect the ball and like my cradling or my stick handling, that's really important. Winning draws, midfielders take draws pretty often, like winning draws, that's really important in our game. We start making a list. Maybe we have 20, 30 qualities that are important. Decision making, we get outside the realm of just physical performance qualities like speed and power and conditioning, beyond technical qualities like my stick handling or like my dodging or my defending, right? We get beyond the tactical elements of my vision, my ability to see my opponents, my ability to create space. We even hopefully get into the qualities of my mindset and my social interactions. What does it look like to be a good leader? What does it look like to be a good follower within this team environment? What does it look like to have resilience when we lose 3 straight draws and give up 3 straight goals. How do we get back on track? What does that look like as a quality that's important, a characteristic that's important for performance? Hopefully the list gets that deep. Now, it doesn't always, which I think is important to give examples that help guide athletes in that a little bit. Certainly the athletes, this could be done with the athletes alone. This could be done with the coaches alone. This could be done with the support staff alone. This could be done as a large group. Let's collect some data. Let's take all of those metrics and then let's rank them. Okay, 30 different characteristics that we think are important. Now, every person rank those in your top 10. What are they? We aggregate all those top 10s. We have an average ranking score and we have 10 characteristics. And all of a sudden, we have a performance profile. And this is, a radar chart circa 1980 something, right? It's a circle with some shaded pencil marks. Our data visualization people would be freaking out on us right now, but this is all it takes, right? This is actual real world sports science as opposed to collecting data that maybe doesn't matter. And so we have an understanding of what the important qualities are. And then once we've defined those qualities, and it's good to create benchmarks of what great world-class all-American looks like and what like needs improvement, not in the starting roster for each of these qualities, what that looks like. Can we create some landmarks for good and bad in those? And then can athletes go through a process of self-assessment, one, ranking themselves on those qualities on a scale of 1 to 10, and potentially even peer assessment, right? Okay, amongst my group of middies, how do I rank myself on these different qualities? And how do I rank my teammates? Coaches are doing this subconsciously all the time. Rarely do they actually formalize that process, record that data so that they can look back on it later and see if they've made the progress, the skill acquisition, the adaptations that they actually wanted. But this is a very simple process that is the heart of performance profiling. Some challenges to that. Engagement is one, right? If you sit there in front of 35 blank stares and you don't have the environment that, or you don't have the trust from them, if you're an external consultant and you just show up at this team and say, hey, we're going to do a fun activity today, you might not get very far. I think there's a massive opportunity for support staff, maybe not coaches, but support staff to facilitate this process because they've got such close relationships and trust with their athletes in the first place. I believe sports scientists are well suited to facilitate this sort of a process. Creativity is another one, right? Sit there for minutes with blank stares like, oh, what does good performance look like? Sometimes providing a framework to work off of is helpful. And we're going to go through that a little bit today. We have a framework that talks about physical qualities, sport qualities, and mental skills, right? And it's like, okay, there's 3 buckets to start with. Now fill those buckets. And maybe that gets people moving a little bit. Anchors, I mentioned this before, but like for each of these qualities, let's define good and bad pretty clearly and see if we can have some consensus on that. That goes back to my hockey example, right? Just having that shared vocabulary of good and bad on a specific quality, so we're all sure that we're talking about the same thing, is really, really important. Context is massive. That's why making this sport specific, having the athletes or the coaches do it themselves is so much more valuable than if we sit in a room as sports scientists or athletic trainers who maybe know enough about the sport. We can set the target a degree off and 1,000 miles away, and we'll end up in the wrong spot, right? Perspective, really having a 360-degree assessment. So it's not just my technical sport skills. It's not just my physical qualities. We all have biases. Strength and conditioning coaches will talk about speed and strength like all day long, but maybe that doesn't make the top 10 actually of the most important things. If you can't catch and pass, none of that other stuff probably matters, right? And then let's be honest, there's an element of subjectivity and bias within all of these, right? How is that athlete going to self-score versus the value of scoring their teammates versus the value of like coaches scoring people versus more like diverse engagement. And so we want to take all of those into account as we go through this process. Now, all of these challenges can be achieved, and building a framework to help put some of these pieces in place is going to make us a little bit more efficient at that process. And so I spoke about this a little bit earlier. This would be our framework that helps us get on track as quickly as possible, keep some guardrails around what we're trying to accomplish. And so breaking this down into high performance habits as something that contributes, a characteristic that contributes to success. What are the physical elements of the profile that contribute to success? The sport elements, both technical and tactical, and then mental elements, both like mental skills, but also social skills, teamwork, cohesion, all those sorts of things. And so kind of having that framework to work from is a really good place to start. Before I go on any further, questions, comments here. Has anybody tried this? Has anybody run into challenges with this? Does this seem way too simple?
I have a question. One thing that I've run across is, I guess, the diversity or the agreement on some of the high performance habits, or like having that top 10. Maybe that's just across like what the sport coach and maybe the performance department and athletic training, and then the medical side, like having everyone together. Kind of what is your strategy to kind of go about, I guess, navigating some of those disagreements instead of just kind of being held up in that process of defining those?
Yeah, so practically speaking, I like a rule of threes. Just keeps things simple, right? So high performance habits, we're going to select 3. We can brainstorm 10 and let's select 3. Now, if we want to vote on those independently, or if we want to rank those independently, we can capture that data and we can create an average ranking and a top score. And like, right or wrong, like that's the ranking that we came up with today. Let's do something about it, see if it works. If it doesn't work, maybe our rankings weren't right, and we can address that. Same physical profile. Okay, what are the top 3? Sport profile, what are the top 3? Mental profile, what are the top 3? We'll get into that a little bit more, but I find having an somewhat equal distribution while also giving everyone a chance to have that like shared input and take the average score and go with it. See what happens. You might be off a little bit, but at least you did something.
We have a question in the chat here. So the question is, how do we communicate what skills are important between the different coaches to meet at the midpoint?
I think that's where it comes back to, asking them ultimately, we want the coaches to define this or the athletes to define it for themselves, so that I'm not trying to tell anybody. The last thing I want to do is tell a lacrosse coach what the most important skills are. Now, I might have my opinion on that, but like, that's not a battle I'm going to fight. So best case scenario, I have them tell me. And now this could be done across an entire organization. It could be done with the athletes, or you could go through this whole process with just the coaches and say, hey, coach, I want to make sure our program meets the needs, the style that you want to play. So I want to go through this, activity. It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes to define what the goals of your program are from a sports skill standpoint, from a mental skill standpoint, and from a physical skill standpoint. I want to make sure as a support staff member, I'm giving you exactly what you need. I think you're going to get really good buy-in there. You might not agree with everything, and you might want to like adjust some things through the process, but if nothing else, you're going to get really clear on their expectations of you. And like I said, like that collaboration, that shared vocabulary might actually be the most valuable part of this process, whether you actually implement effective strategies to accomplish any of this stuff or not. Just the relationships and the trust that you build through the process is probably worth it. There aren't any other pressing questions. We'll kind of move on. So next step, this is a little bit of the background, the history of performance profiling. we're going to take it into our model here at the University of Oregon just a little bit. And this would be my challenge for each of you. Like you said, Nick, you sat down and you tried to come up with like a framework and you're like, wow, this is hard. And it is hard. I would encourage you guys to go through that process, and hopefully putting some guidelines or a framework around that will help you a little bit. But think of a sport and how would you go about putting together a framework for this sport? And this is the way our framework looks, or what our framework looks like for a lot of the sports that we try to do this with here at Oregon. So we always start with the end of the mine. We have a saying here at Oregon, win the day. I think it goes back to the early 2000s football era and lightning orange uniforms or lightning yellow uniforms or whatever. But important to begin with the end in mind. Competitive success is one of the targets. Student athlete experience might be one of those targets. That positive, collaborative, high performance environment is definitely one of the targets. From there, we want to hit the foundation. So our high performance habits, we define really simply around sleep, nutrition and hydration, and regeneration. Within each of those, there's numerous elements, but if we can focus our messaging around those three things all the time, are we getting the sleep that we need? Are we eating and hydrating appropriately? And are we being a little bit proactive in our recovery, whether that's, compression, Normatex, whether that's, hot tubs, cold tubs, whatever those strategies might be, it's really the habits that are important, not the, almost not the content. It's the behaviors, right? I think as support staff, performance coaches, whatever we may be, our biggest influence is habits and behavior change. If we can influence that in our athletes, we've won, regardless of what the actual content is. And then we're going to go into our three pillars. So our physical profile, our sport profile, and our mental profile. I'm going to start with the mental profile and talk just a little bit about this. We break that down into two buckets. So mental skills and social skills. We focus on resilience, focus, and confidence. We've distilled mental skills into those three primary qualities. And I'll go into that a little bit more, how we do that. Social skills, we talk about connection, leadership, and teamwork. Three different things, but all related to how the group interacts together. On the physical qualities, we break that into two buckets as well. We talk about performance qualities and durability qualities. So strength and power, speed and agility, and conditioning or capacity of some variation. Those are our performance qualities. Durability, this pertains to mitigating injury risk, and we look at range of motion, isolated strength, and motor control, things that we want to measure, assess, profile, monitor throughout the training process. And then our third one is that sport profile. And again, we break that into technical skills and tactical awareness. And again, this is really sport by sport, that skill that's most important, number one, number two, number three. It's a short list, so it's really tough, right? And it's going to be specific not only to the sport, but to the position within that sport. But really working with our coaches to narrow that down and define that and prioritize those in and of itself is a huge accomplishment. And then tactical awareness. This is game knowledge, vision. Do I see the field? Do I see the players around me? And then based off of that, am I making good decisions? Game knowledge for our football players is like, man, do I know my playbook? When the play is called, do I run the right route? Those types of things, really simple, really basic, and we can actually measure and quantify those as well. Now, building that framework is great. Each of you could take a sport and say, all right, how would I go about that? What are the high performance habits that I like? What are the things how do I want to break out that physical bucket versus that sport bucket versus that mental bucket? And it can look like a lot of things. For me, I believe in a performance-centric approach to sports science as opposed to a technology-centric approach. I think we get it backwards when we start with technology and we say, wow, here is this really cool tool that measures this. That other school is successful and they have it, so we need it. Let's start collecting this. All of a sudden we have data. We may analyze that data. We may start trying to even drive an intervention based off of it. We're putting it into the system without ever having a framework to start with. we don't actually understand the people who are in our environment, the problems that they're trying to solve, the questions that are keeping them up at night. We don't understand those well enough. And so as a result, we're trying to solve problems that or answer questions that people aren't actually asking. So I think a performance-centric approach starts with the people, having great relationships, listening and understanding so that we can define the problems, and then building processes to solve those problems. And the process, that's where technology sometimes is useful, is beneficial. The process might include objective data collection, analysis, that builds a decision tree or a framework for intervention. But it doesn't always have to be that way. And one of the things I'm going to try to share with you today is how we can do sports science with as little technology as possible. We can complete this entire performance profiling approach with zero technology. And so I talk about this a lot, right? Collecting data. We think of data as a number that comes out of a machine far too often. Data can just as much be something that we measure subjectively. And so there's kind of this concept of data being simple to complex. There's a scale, right? And there's a scale of subjective to objective. And if we use the example of how we would go about profiling speed, there's a lot of different ways. We could get really complex and really objective. We could use force plates and motion capture. We're fortunate enough to have 5 meters of instrumented track that we can put our athletes on and do an acceleration trial and capture all sorts of information. We could use radar guns and do force velocity profiling. We do that as well. Video analysis, again, there's apps with AI in our pocket that will provide us with a bunch of metrics on speed assessment at the moment. It's really cool stuff to dig into. Timing gates have been around for a long time. Those are a great option, a little bit simpler, maybe a little bit less objective just because of, you know, how you start or when an athlete might pass through them. But let's be honest, the stopwatch was the original sports science technology back in who knows when, right? Roger Bannister was, you know, timing his intervals with a stopwatch and broke a 4-minute mile. That's yeah, that's the OG sports technology right there. And it's still really valuable today, right? If we want to capture data on our athletes and profile their speed. But maybe we don't even have a stopwatch and we could just let our athletes race. Let's break them up, let them race. Maybe I'll take a video and see who finishes in the front half versus the back half. And I've got fast athletes and I've got slower athletes. And if I want to develop speed, or if these athletes are already fast and I want to develop a different quality, then maybe they go in a different training program than my athletes who I want to develop speed with. The key is capturing some information and doing something with it. And even more simple than racing, I could probably just ask, say, hey, coach, here's our roster. I want you to rate each of these athletes from 1 to 10 on, you know, slow to fast. Coach could probably go through that process, give them a number, and I'm going to end up with something that might be pretty close to my timing gates, my video analysis, my radar force velocity profile. And not only might it be close, it might be more meaningful because the coach is thinking about the speed that they actually utilize within their sport, maybe even in game situations versus some sort of testing environment that may not reflect this type of speed that is actually important for performance. So one of the biggest things I want you guys to take away from today is like, we can do science, we can capture data on anything in a very simple and subjective way, oftentimes starting with just asking. Let's start by asking, do something with that information. And if it's not quite good enough, let's go find the technology to answer our question at a little bit deeper level. So before I go any further, questions, building a framework, putting some guardrails around that, and capturing data. For those of you who are maybe intimidated, I know sports science, one of the most intimidating things about sports science is like the data side of it, right? It's like, ooh, do I have to learn to program in R? Like, ooh, do I have to learn Power BI so I can visualize this stuff? trust me, if you just have everybody fill out, like honestly, print them out a piece of paper and have them write numbers into it. It's manual, but if you type those numbers into Excel and have the most basic knowledge of Excel to create means and standard deviations for each of those qualities that people subjectively rated, you're going to be able to create really, really good profiles. That's all it takes. And that's real data. We can't discount that as being not real data. It might not be, there's some bias to it, might not be valid. It could be unreliable, but let's start with it and let's do something about it instead of collecting a bunch of information that never drives any action. No questions? All right, we'll plug away. So what I want to do is just give you a little bit of a perspective of how we go about capturing data here in our environment at the University of Oregon. Now, remember, we're relatively well-resourced, both from a technology standpoint and a manpower standpoint. We've got a relatively good history of doing this for a period of time. So this isn't what it looked like on day one. This has taken years upon years to build to the point where we have the relationships and trust to integrate this stuff on a regular basis. This is just a little bit of a peek under the hood of what it looks like for us to profile some of these qualities. So looking at our performance profiling, we talk about strength and power, speed and agility, and conditioning. We'll do isometric squat testing on a force plate as our main measure of lower body strength. We do an iso squat as opposed to an isometric mid-thigh pull, just so that we don't have to do with grip and like straps and whatever as a limiting factor. It's a little bit more familiar for our athletes to do like a squat pattern instead of a pull pattern. Not right or wrong, just the way that where we've landed on it. We'll also do load velocity profiles with our velocity-based tools for both squat and bench press. Really valuable. I think it's a great training stimulus, and it's actionable because we get target velocities, or we get target loads for a specific velocity. So not only can we test, but then all of a sudden we can train based off of that testing, even within the same session. For power, we'll do a lot of our force plate jump variations, a counter movement jump, a single leg counter movement jump, and a single leg hop. Those would be the three that we rely on primarily. For speed, we'll do a force velocity profile with a radar gun of a 30-meter sprint. This is our most cumbersome technology. It's not user-friendly like, a force plate system. It's force plates 15 years ago when you had to export the data into MATLAB and like run your own analysis or something, right? So it's frustrating. New technologies are coming onto the market, and we're trying to build systems that make that more user-friendly internally. But that's where we're at. Because we value the information, it allows us to understand both max velocity and acceleration as two distinct qualities that we may not get as good of information on from, say, just timing gates or some other technology there. Deceleration is a newer one for us. So measuring deceleration, we use a modified acceleration deceleration assessment. If you follow Damian Harper and the popularity of deceleration at the moment, you'd be familiar with that, but we'll do a 10-yard acceleration followed by a maximal deceleration. So it's not the full ADA out to 30 meters, but for us, a 10-yard is most appropriate. We'll also look at a change of direction deficit test, or a 505 change of direction test. And then for capacity or conditioning, we really like the 30-15 intermittent fitness test just because it's field-based and it has clear training prescriptions off the back of it. But we're always exploring and experimenting with other options there as well. Durability, looking at range of motion, isolated strength, motor control. We focus on some major joints for us. So we'll look at the hip, 5 different directions of range of motion at the hip. Ankle dorsiflexion is huge for us. And shoulder, 6 different ranges of motion there. We'll use the force frame to look at isolated strength in 6 different planes of movement with the hip. So adduction, abduction, internal rotation, external rotation, and flexion extension. So looking at the symmetry, the relationship between those peak isometric forces around the hip. We'll also look at shoulder internal, external rotation with the force frame. And isolated strength, we'll use the Nord board for an eccentric peak hamstring strength measure. Motor control, not perfect, but a very basic assessment, an overhead squat a Y balance test and an upper quarter Y balance test to just look at some functional movement and motor control in those movement screen exercises. If we go into our sport profile, this is definitely an area where we still have a lot of work to do. This is an entire field of sports science known as performance analytics. At the collegiate level, it's an under-resourced space. At the professional level, we're seeing a lot more analysts and people using statistical models to predict, like, winning percentages and goal differentials and things like that. This is where we would come back to touching on some of the stats that we do have from various sports, but really leaning into connecting with our coaches on the skills that they're trying to develop and finding ways to quantify those. It's like, okay, can we have a drill that is subjectively scored that quantifies that ability? Can we have a training program, a skill acquisition program, and can we measure that again in the future and get information, even if it's not perfect information, on the development that we have in that space? So definitely an area where there's opportunity for growth for us here in the sport profiling space. And then the mental profiling space, we hear about mental health all the time. There's massive investment in mental health across collegiate athletics and athletics as a whole. My 2-second soapbox, I'm a proponent of proactive mental skills development, which hopefully give athletes the ability to cope in a lot of different ways and mitigate mental health like disasters down the road. Right now, I think we're mostly investing in mental health resources to deal with issues long after they've started. And I'd like to see us be a little bit more proactive in that. There's some great papers on profiling mental skills, and there's a lot of validated psychological questionnaires in order to do that. There's an eight skill model, which is really interesting. I think there's a lot of value there. It kind of narrows it down to the 3 most important skills related to self-talk, self-confidence, and cognitive anxiety. And then there's a lot of people who look into the social side of things. A lot of us have heard of the big 5 from a personality profile. But the one thing that emerges from some of that research is the importance of emotional stability as a social characteristic, because it really drives a lot of those mental skills as well. And so we are probably still early stages in the implementation of some proactive mental skills assessment tools, questionnaires, and we are partnering with some companies who have some mental skills training apps that are still early stages, but have some promise for facilitating discussions as much as anything, and giving athletes resources to actually work on this stuff. Because right at the moment, there is very, very, very little proactive work being done on developing skills in this space. So now what? If we go back to our step 1, 2, 3 of performance profiling, what are the next steps? What do we do now? We talk about step 4, prioritizing needs, step 5, creating action plans, and step 6, identifying barriers to success, making sure that before we get started, we think about what could stop us in our tracks if we're not careful. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how we practically do that here at the University of Oregon. But before I do, any questions about some of the technology that we use, or our approach to profiling physical, sport, mental skills that I just covered?
I have a quick question. So I was actually a part of a team that did some sports profiling, and I felt like the the actual athletes and the coaches had somewhat of, I would say, different outlooks on what was subjective and objective. So obviously the objective stuff is a little bit easier when you have times and numbers and it's very clear like what's good and what's not good. But how do you manage like disagreement between coaches and players when it's more subjective, like the sports skills or even like the social and the mental skills? Like, how do you build trust between the athletes and the coaches about like, okay, let's agree and find a way to, like, I don't know, move forward with what we do have or what's come up kind of.
Yeah, I think there's two different ways to go about that. And it's a strategic approach that has to happen one way or the other. Either you've got a coaching staff who's self-aware and emotionally intelligent and willing to engage their athletes in the process, recognizing that they're releasing some control as a result. And it's important to engage the athletes, but it might not go exactly the way I hope it does. In which case, that coach has a problem to solve. Either they say, yep, that was great, but I don't believe any of it. We're going to do this, which probably erodes trust. Or they say, wow, that's a different perspective from what I had, but I really value that. Let's find some common ground. The other option would be the coach like builds their own model and implements that with their athletes to some degree. And I think we probably see that approach a little bit more often. Well, there's probably always opportunities for athlete feedback and influence there. But a lot of times coaches would have a technical or tactical model that they believe in. And they spend all their time trying to sell their athletes on why this is right, why we need to play this way, why we need to work on these skills so much. I'm not saying one is right or wrong. They're two different approaches strategically, and it depends on the coach's willingness to release a little bit of control. If you let the athletes have more say, you're going to get much more immediate buy-in. You don't have to spend any time selling them on why this is important because they came up with it themselves. So that can be a massive opportunity. On the other hand, if you really, really, really think the athletes are way off base, you know way more than them, then that could cause some additional challenges. So all that to say, I probably don't have like the perfect example answer for you. But it depends on that coach's willingness to engage the athletes in the process.
Great, thank you.
I had a question too. So when you go through these 6 steps and you implement it with a team, how often are you kind of vetting your framework or making adjustments, or kind of what does that process look like? Whether it's like time of year or like kind of meeting to look at the framework.
For us, we have like 3 really good opportunities for most sports. Coming into preseason is a great chance. Well, and it depends. If we stick with the lacrosse model, right? They actually are a spring sport for us, which means coming into the fall, we've got incoming freshmen, we've got a whole new group. It's a new team, right? In a lot of ways, and we're starting from scratch. So that's a great opportunity to go through this process together and create alignment amongst that group and set some targets. We've got 10 weeks to like work on that. There's a few like, off-season competitive matches in there, but we're not competing during that period of the season. It's supposed to be mostly developmental, right? So that's a great opportunity at the beginning of that. And then at the end of that, we're going into Christmas break. Let's talk about what worked, what was off base. Let's get some feedback. Let's refine that model. We're going to measure again, like changes across that period of time to see if we made the progress that we wanted to make. And if we didn't, maybe we need better information, or maybe we need to change this a little bit. But that's a good time because in the winter, we're going to come back and go right into preseason for our season. So a check-in going into preseason, and we're going to execute like throughout the course of the season. And then we're going to debrief at the end of that season there. So for most sports, there's 3 good times to do that: preseason, end of season, and then start of like an off season type of window, something like that.
Perfect. Thanks.
I'm going to keep going here. I don't have too much left, but yeah, want to go into a little bit more about what this looks like for us. We have our performance framework here at the University of Oregon that helps us. This defines our goals in sports science, right? I'm going to start with the end in mind. We call it winning. From there, we want to do what we call profile, load, and monitor. Everything we can do falls into those 3 buckets somehow. First, profiling the sport. What are the demands of the game? What are the risks, injury incidents, for example? KPIs, again, is a term that may be related to like sports analytics. And where possible, is there something we understand, whether that's shots on goal or, you know, any number of different, if there's something that our coaching staff usually feels is valuable, like let's make sure we understand that. And we want to make sure we frame everything amongst these, you know, 3 elements. If you think physical, sport, and mental, or 5 different elements: physical, technical, tactical, social, mental, right? From there, we're going to profile the athlete. Sometimes that's objective measurements with sports technology. Sometimes that's subjective questionnaires or self-assessments, right? All of those are a great way to go about it. Loading for us is just developing a process that is designed to elicit an adaptation. We think of loading as training load a lot. It could be in the weight room. It could be on the field. What's our, like, on-field week by week load progression that we want from a fitness standpoint for this group of athletes during the preseason? It could be, how are we strategically developing self-talk amongst this group throughout the preseason? We want to improve that skill. What's the curriculum to teach that? What are the assignments to practice that? And what is the collaborative group like reflection or feedback to help develop that? Could be any of those things. And then monitoring is something that we want to include in the process. We don't just want to test at the beginning, at the end. Ideally, we're capturing data through that whole process to show us a trajectory and a trend rather than single data points on either end. And so that could look different. Sometimes that's weekly jump tests for us to look at response to load and fatigue and recovery. Sometimes that's velocities and loads and velocities on the bar in the weight room to ensure that things are moving in the right direction. Could look like a lot of different things, but ultimately that monitoring establishes a trend that is a cyclical and process that reinforms the athlete profile and reprioritizes their needs. This is an example of our athlete physical profile and how we break that down. We give them an overall score of athleticism, and then we compare that to the average for their sport and position. And that's just a combination of strength, power, speed, and conditioning. Again, we touched on this already, so I'm not going to go too much deeper, but we have a few different tests that contribute to each of those. Normative data is really, really important for this kind of stuff. I think that's one of the most important concepts in sports science is your data is only as good as the context that you have for it. A single data point tells you nothing unless you have a population to compare it to. And so we would compare all of our athletes, break them into male and female athletes across all sports, and give them a percentile rank. Understanding that some sports require higher levels of strength, we also are able to compare that to a sport average and a position average within that. So we can see an overall male rank for that physical quality, and we can compare it to the averages in their sport and position. And that quickly allows us to take a look at that profile and recognize strengths and weaknesses pretty quickly and prioritize our needs for what I call targeted, not necessarily individualized training. In a lot of environments, it's unrealistic to truly have individualized training. But I think in every environment, it's irresponsible not to have targeted training. That could be 2 groups, a strength group and a speed group. It could be 3 groups. But within your training program, there are naturally going to be people who have different needs, and we need to address those. In collegiate athletics, one of our biggest challenges is NCAA like hours restrictions or hours allocations, right? And so in an off-season period, we have 8 hours. Traditionally, that's 4 in the weight room and 4 on the field. Well, what about the athlete who's already strong and powerful and fast, but they can't catch and pass? Should they spend the same 4 hours in the weight room as everybody else and 4 hours on the field? It doesn't really make any sense. It's very difficult because people have been in these team environments for so long, to think outside of the box of, okay, how can we actually prioritize extra skill development for some athletes versus other athletes who maybe need more physical development, from a really simple standpoint. And so challenges to address, no doubt, but I think that's where the real value is how can we target athletes' needs a little bit better. The limitations are definitely time and energy. How much energy do our athletes have for training, and how much time, if that's restricted by their class schedule and NCAA CARA hours, or if that's, in a professional environment, could be a collective bargaining agreement. It could be just purely hours in the day in some cases. And so I think we need to have really good clarity amongst the team on what that primary need is, and how we're going to address that, whether that's a physical quality, a sport quality, or a mental quality. They should have one primary area of need, and everybody should be really clear about that, including the athlete. Like, what do I want to change the most? If we try to do too many things at the same time, we're always going to come up empty. The more we can focus, the more success we'll have. And then very practically, we want to target a specific stimulus. My perspective, but I find far too many training programs are generic in nature, and we're trying to cover all the boxes. Like, yep, I did 2 pulls for every push, and I hit my posterior chain, and I hit my ankle dorsiflexion correctives, and I have my hip adduction exercises in there. So I've covered my bases, but we were so broad in general that we never actually targeted a single stimulus that would provide enough to get a clear adaptation. And so by prioritizing those needs and creating what I call mini blocks of training, if you break your hour in the weight room into 15-minute blocks, you have 4 blocks that could be targeted towards a different need. And if we have 3 different physical needs that we prioritize in the weight room, the number of blocks that we allocate towards each athlete could be a way that we quantify how much stimulus we target with each of those groups. That's one simple and practical way to think about it. And lastly, I always like to talk about this when it comes to athlete profiling. What we're trying to create is the perfect storm. That's an organization with clarity on what we're trying to accomplish, collaboration amongst all the stakeholders, administration, strength and conditioning, athletic medicine, sport coaches, the athlete themselves. There's a lot of collaboration there, and clarity as a result. And then we're just communicating on a regular basis. We all speak the same language about what we're trying to accomplish. When this hockey scout says speed, this hockey scout understands what he's talking about. And when we have that happen, it's a truly unique organization that's capable of really special results. But it's rare to find, and it takes people who are willing to fight the hard fight. And that looks like not staying in your lane, but getting out of your lane. I like to finish with this sarcastic motivational poster. Stay in your lane, or be careful not to bump into anyone on the road to irrelevance. I think staying in your lane is bad advice. If you want to make a difference, you got to get out of your lane. You got to rub shoulders with other people. Don't step on their toes, but get your feet in the same puddle and work through some problems. It's not going to be easy. You're going to have difficult conversations. You're going to have to put your ego aside, and you're going to have to make compromises sometimes, but that's the only way to move forward and get better as a group. So I know we're getting up short on time. We've had some opportunities for questions throughout, but yeah, I've got more time here if anyone has a few more questions for me.
I've got one. Jordan, I'm curious if you have like a framework for establishing what physical performance tests you want to use, and then is there like a criteria that the test has to meet if you want to introduce like a new physical performance assessment?
So it depends what you want to do about it, right? Which might be the coach is like, oh man, we're looking slow out there compared to our competition. It's like, all right, well, we should probably profile speed. Or like, oh, man, it feels like we're just unfit, right? We hear that from coaches all the time. Oh, we're just not fit enough. Well, we better profile our condition. We better measure that somehow. Otherwise, we're always just going to use the eye test and say we're unfit. So how can we measure that? Now, again, going back to like, I want to start with something simple and subjective, start there, and gradually get more complex and more objective if I have to. Let's start with something simple. Let's do something about it. And then let's measure again. I think so. My only criteria would be that it's a real problem that someone is asking or a question that someone's asking, and whatever the results of my measure are, I'm going to take action on those results. I'm going to divide them into groups and train them differently, or I'm going to prioritize, skill work over physical development. Those are my two criteria. It's a real problem, and I'm going to do something about it. From there, obviously, validity and reliability when it comes to technology, is it actually telling you what it's supposed to tell you, are very important. But that doesn't matter unless you're going to do something with the information anyway, and unless somebody cares about that question anyway.
That's a great answer. Thanks.
I had a question if you still had time.
Yeah.
I appreciate you kind of taking the time with us. My curiosity is if you put yourself like in hypotheticals, and let's say you put yourself in a place to where you're starting a program at a university or an institution that has no prior history of running this kind of system, but they are giving you kind of resources to build it over time. And let's say you have like a small strength staff and a small sprint staff with about 12 to 16 teams. What is your first step? Like, what do you think is the most, I guess, your highest priority, and how would you kind of work to establish that over a few years?
Yeah. I'd go back to those those principles, right? Let's start with a performance-centric approach instead of a technology-centric approach, first and foremost, right? Let's understand those people, and let's really define their problems and their questions. So with that strength staff, like, what do they need to understand if their training is not targeted in any way right now, right? They've got a blanket program across their whole team. Maybe they have a blanket program that's the same for multiple teams, which is fine. That's based on their philosophy. But what do they need to understand? What does that coach want to know in order to be a little bit more targeted in their training? Once I understand that, I can say, okay, I have no resources, but let's ask the coach, right? Is it strength or speed or power that these athletes need? Let's define those qualities, ask the coach, and then target our training around that. That's a way to start. And then from there, we can get more detailed with technology a little bit at a time if we need to. But man, we collect way too much information. We spend way too much money on technology that sits in a closet and is rarely used. When it is used, it doesn't actually influence anyone's decisions. So subjective measures, and yeah, asking your coaches, what do you need to understand? What do you want to know about your athletes better? Going through that process, building the relationships along the way is the most valuable thing that you can do, for sure. It doesn't sound sexy. It's not what people think of when they want sports science necessarily. But it's by far the most impactful intervention you can make.
Yeah, that makes sense. I appreciate it.
Hey, Jordan, I got a quick question. Thanks for doing this. This is great.
Yeah.
With regards to, let's say you have a small team and you're looking to implement, coach or whatever says, we feel we're slow compared to team X or team Y, and you're new to collecting data, right? So all you're going to have to benchmark against is yourself. So how do you know you're slow? Because you have nothing to compare it to, other than over time you can see if you improved, which is great. But have you come across any resources for good benchmarking for various different common tests of athleticism or tests of physical performance that you can utilize to kind of, whether it be college athletics, Division I, or professional athletics, and then you can even dial it down deeper to positional, in a given sport? Like, what have you found to be helpful?
again, that's where you could go to published literature. There's generally, regardless of the sports, there's always something published on physical profiles of, performance qualities across different tiers in a lot of different sports. You can go there. It can be a decent place to start. Their methods might not always be the same as your methods, which is difficult. Same, like, I'll use the example of like load monitoring, for lack of a better term, but coaches always like, well, I want to know, like, when we're like, oh, coach, we should probably target our big days around, 8 kilometers of total distance or something like that. And they're like, well, what does that university do? Like, they look fit and they're successful. So like, I want to know how much they're doing and make sure they're not doing more than us, which is hard. You can connect with other people at other universities. I think most practitioners are willing to share a lot of that stuff. It's not usually secret sauce. But I think coaches want to compare themselves to others when, in fact, back to your speed question, it would be understanding what they mean by we're not fast enough in the first place. It's like, oh, okay, we're not fast enough. Coach, can you take me through the roster and rate each of our players on how fast you think they are? Is it because our fast players aren't fast enough? Is it because we have too many like medium speed players? Or is it actually 2 or 3 people who are legitimately slow, who you just keep seeing getting blown past all the time? And it makes us look bad and it's costing us in critical circumstances, because that could be a tactical challenge. Look, you're putting a slow athlete in a bad situation where tactically, like, they're not going to be able to perform at that level. Can we get them a little bit faster? Maybe, but maybe we need to put different people in those situations, which is hard conversations to have. But at least starting by saying like, okay, well, look through our roster and tell me who's fast and who's slow, because at least then it's a starting point. Might help.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Jordan, I had a question around some of the like sports specific like testing that you could do, or like assessments. Would you, or in your experience, have you blended like standardized athletic testing with sports specific, like doing a beep test on the ice for hockey players, or putting a soccer ball at the feet of an athlete while they're doing like a 40-meter dash or something like that? Do you think there's any value in experimenting with that?
Well, 2 specific examples. Yep. Beep test on the ice. Absolutely. Like, their skating skill is going to be the fundamental determinant for their skating efficiency of their on ice capacity. So I definitely want to assess it in that way. And it's kind of a blend, right? It's like, yes, your fundamental skill is important. Sprinting with a soccer ball, honestly, we haven't done that. I think it would be a fair thing to do potentially. It just comes back to like, the question you're trying to answer. And maybe it comes back to like, okay, if we're not fast enough as a team, is that because we're not creating separation on breakaways with the ball? Or is it because we're getting beaten downfield without the ball? And don't do things that your coach is going to scoff at. That's rule number 1. You'll lose your credibility really quick if you're like, oh, coach, we got to sprint. We got to do our sprints like with the ball. And they're like, I don't know about that. If your coach is really pushing for it, then maybe it's worth doing. If they're not, then use your best judgment.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. My coach wanted to do those things and we tried it out. So yeah, we'll see if there's development there. But yeah, no, you're right about the buy-in. Yeah.
No harm in trying. It might not actually tell you what you want to know, but man, help the coaches. Yeah. Help them feel like they're being heard. That goes a long ways.
So to piggyback on that, Jordan. So, we oftentimes, at least in my work as a therapist, we try not to, if there's a skill issue, we work on the skill. If there's a power speed issue, we work on a power speed issue. We don't necessarily try to bring the two together, because I think there is some separation. So would you say if somebody doesn't run fast with the ball, is that a speed problem, or is that a skill problem of their ball handling per se? And how would you really kind of work on separating those two? Would you really work more in the gym if somebody was deficient in that, or would you work more on the skill aspect of it? Or, do you feel there is value in working on both?
Ideally, you want to measure both, right? And ideally, there would be other measures of that skill other than like, okay, there's speed with the ball. Let's also measure speed without the ball. That's usually pretty easy to do. And then let's measure maybe their general like passing ability or like dribbling ability in general, not at speed, but like, yeah, how are we quantifying their ball control as a more skill focused assessment, their speed as a physical assessment, and then there's the blend of those. Ideally, we would have an idea of all three. Well, I'd love to answer more questions. Please feel free to reach out to me at any point. LinkedIn is a good place to get in touch with me. I've got my kids like art fair tonight, so I'm gonna run and get to their elementary school. But it was great to meet all of you and have a little bit of chat, and look forward to supporting you in any way that I can.